This is an urgent message, not really meant for everyone because the fact remains that just like in the days of Noah, many will treat important and urgent messages like this with contempt, but it's our deepest desire that such will not be the case for anyone who watches this video. This video reveals a pending disaster that is coming, but most importantly, and the reason for sharing this experience, is the secret plant Jesus instructed everyone who wants to survive the coming days to plant. This is not gimmicks. This is God's mercy towards His children. Now kindly tell us where you are watching from so that we can connect as family, and if you desire, we can pray with you. Drop your prayer request and our intercessory team will take it from there. I will begin sharing today's experience. My name is Obikwe Nelson, and I am 70 years old. For the past 6 months, I had been battling liver cancer. The doctors said it was stage 4 when they found it, which meant it had already spread to other parts of my body. They gave me treatments, chemotherapy that made me sick and weak, but everyone knew, including me, that I was fighting a losing battle. On the evening of January 15, 2026, something went terribly wrong. I was at home with my daughter Grace when suddenly I felt a sharp, crushing pain in my chest. My breathing became difficult, and I could feel my heart beating irregularly, like it was trying to escape from my ribcage. Grace called the ambulance immediately, her voice shaking with fear as she spoke to the operator. The ride to the hospital is something I barely remember. The paramedics were working on me, putting oxygen on my face, checking my pulse, talking to each other in urgent voices. I heard one of them say my blood pressure was dropping fast. Everything seemed to be happening very far away, like I was watching it happen to someone else. When we reached the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed around me. They wheeled me quickly down bright corridors, and I could see the ceiling lights passing above me one after another. Someone was shouting medical terms I didn't understand. I felt needles going into my arms. Then everything started to fade. The pain stopped suddenly. One moment I was gasping for air, feeling like I was drowning, and the next moment there was nothing. No pain. No struggle. Just silence. It was the strangest feeling, like taking off a heavy coat you've been wearing for so long that you forgot it was there. I opened my eyes, or at least I think I did, and I found myself floating. Yes, floating. I could see my body down below on the hospital bed. The doctors were doing chest compressions, pushing down hard on my chest again and again. Someone was preparing a defibrillator, those electric paddles they use to shock the heart. Grace was outside the room, her face pressed against the glass window, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I couldn't feel anything about it. I wasn't scared or sad. I just observed it like watching a movie. Then I noticed I wasn't alone. All around me in this space, I can't really call it a room because there were no walls. There were other figures floating like I was. They looked like people, but they were translucent, almost like they were made of light or mist. These were souls, I realized. Other people who had died or were dying just like me. What struck me most was how different they all looked. Not their appearance exactly, but their expressions and the feeling they gave off. Some of them looked peaceful, almost happy. Their faces were calm, and they seemed to be moving upward, drawn toward something above that I couldn't quite see. These ones had a brightness about them, a soft glow that made them look beautiful despite not having solid bodies anymore. But others looked completely different. Some souls appeared confused, looking around frantically like they were lost. Others looked sad, with expressions of deep regret or sorrow on their faces. A few looked angry or agitated, and they seemed to be struggling against something, fighting to go in a direction they couldn't reach. Some were crying, though I heard no sound. The contrast was stark, some souls radiating peace and others radiating distress. I didn't understand why there was such a difference. What made some souls peaceful while others were troubled? I wanted to ask someone, to understand what I was seeing, but before I could form the thought clearly, everything changed. Without warning, I felt myself being pulled. Not pulled by hands or ropes, but pulled by some invisible force that I couldn't resist. The hospital room vanished. The floating souls disappeared. Everything became a blur of motion and light, and then suddenly I stopped moving. I found myself standing, actually standing with feet on solid ground, in a place I had never seen before. It was a field. A massive, beautiful field that stretched out as far as I could see in every direction. The sky above was bright and clear, the kind of blue you only see on the most perfect spring day. The sun was warm on my skin, but not hot or uncomfortable. A gentle breeze moved across the field, and I could smell earth and growing things. The field was full of crops. Not just one type of plant, but many different kinds growing in organized rows and sections. I could see tomato plants heavy with red fruit, bean plants climbing up poles, rows of what looked like potatoes with their green leaves spreading wide, squash plants with their large leaves and yellow flowers, and many other vegetables and herbs I recognized and some I didn't. Everything was green and healthy, growing with a vitality I had never seen in any garden or farm. The sight was beautiful in a way that made my chest tight. I had lived in cities most of my life, visiting farms only occasionally, but this was different from any farm I had ever seen. The colors were more vivid. The plants looked more alive. Everything seemed to glow slightly with its own inner light. But what truly shocked me, what made me stand there with my mouth open, were the people working in the field. Real, solid-looking people were tending the crops. They were weeding, watering, harvesting, planting. Some worked alone, others in small groups. They moved with purpose and joy, like they loved what they were doing. These weren't translucent souls like I had seen floating in the hospital. These were people who looked as real as I used to look, wearing simple work clothes, with dirt on their hands and sweat on their faces. And then I saw the angels. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, they were really there. Beautiful, powerful beings moved among the crops and the workers. They were taller than humans, with a presence that made you notice them even when they were standing still. Some had wings that seemed to be made of light itself, while others looked almost human except for the way they glowed and the authority they carried. The angels were working too. I watched as one angel walked down a row of bean plants, and as he passed, the plants seemed to grow stronger, standing straighter, producing more beans. Another angel stood near a group of tomato plants, and I saw him do something with his hands. No tools, just his hands, and suddenly the plants were heavier with fruit than they had been a moment before. Another angel was near a worker who was struggling to remove a stubborn weed, and the angel simply touched the ground next to the weed, and it came loose easily. The angels weren't just watching or guarding. They were actively ensuring everything grew perfectly, abundantly, powerfully. They were making sure every crop produced the maximum harvest it possibly could. It was like they were partnering with the human workers, with the humans doing the physical work and the angels multiplying the results beyond what would naturally be possible. I stood there stunned, trying to understand what I was seeing. Based on everything I had heard from other people who had near-death experiences, I expected to find myself in heaven, you know, the heaven you see in pictures, with pearly gates and golden streets and clouds and harps and all that. Or I expected to see my deceased relatives waiting to greet me, or maybe to have a life review where I saw all my mistakes and good deeds played back to me. But this was completely unexpected. Why was I standing in a field full of crops? Why were there humans here working alongside angels? Why wasn't I in some traditional version of heaven with God on a throne and angels singing? This looked more like the most perfect farm that could ever exist, not what I imagined the afterlife would be. I had so many questions spinning in my head that I felt dizzy. Was this actually heaven? Was this some kind of test? Was I supposed to start working in the field too? Why were angels helping crops grow? What did any of this mean? Then, without any warning or announcement, I felt a presence beside me. Not heard footsteps, not saw someone approaching from a distance, just suddenly knew that someone was standing right next to me. I turned my head slowly, almost afraid of what I would see. He was there. Jesus. I knew instantly who it was, though I can't fully explain how I knew. It wasn't because he looked like the paintings in churches. Actually, he didn't look exactly like those paintings. It wasn't because he had a halo or was glowing more brightly than everything else, though there was definitely something luminous about him. I just knew deep in my soul, in a way that didn't require explanation or proof, that this was Jesus Christ himself standing next to me. His eyes were the first thing I really noticed. They were kind but also serious. When he looked at me, I felt like he could see everything, every thought I'd ever had, every mistake I'd made, every good thing I'd done, every fear I carried. But instead of feeling judged or ashamed, I felt understood. Completely, totally understood in a way no other human had ever understood me. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood there with me, looking out over the field of crops with the angels and humans working together. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt peaceful, like being with an old friend who doesn't need to fill every moment with conversation. Finally, he turned to face me more directly, and when he spoke, his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight and authority. It was gentle, but it commanded attention. And somehow, even though he spoke in words I heard with my ears, I also felt like he was speaking directly to my heart at the same time. He told me that I was seeing something important, something I needed to understand and remember. He explained that what I was witnessing in this field was not just a beautiful scene but a picture of what was coming, a warning of what people on Earth needed to prepare for. Then he began to show me things, not just here in the field, but visions that appeared before my eyes like watching a movie screen. Except these weren't movies. They felt completely real, like I was actually there experiencing them. He showed me the world as it is now, cities full of people going about their daily lives, shopping in grocery stores with shelves stacked high with food, gas stations with plenty of fuel, hospitals with all the medicines and equipment they need, people confident that they can always buy what they need when they need it. Then the vision shifted, and I saw those same cities, those same places, but everything had changed dramatically. The grocery stores I saw had empty shelves. Not just low on stock, but completely bare. The metal shelves were visible with nothing on them except dust and a few scattered items that people had knocked to the floor in their desperation. Lines of people stretched out the doors of stores, waiting for deliveries that never came or fighting over the last few packages of rice or beans. I saw gas stations with long lines of cars, sometimes stretching for miles. Many pumps had plastic bags over them with handwritten signs saying, "No fuel" or "Out of service." People were abandoning their cars on the side of the road because they couldn't find gas to keep going. Pharmacies had locked their doors. Through the windows, I could see empty shelves inside. Handwritten notices were taped to the doors explaining that they had no inventory, no medicines to sell, no idea when new supplies would arrive. Hospitals were turning people away. Not because they didn't want to help, but because they didn't have the supplies to treat them. No medicines. No equipment. No materials for basic procedures. Doctors and nurses stood helplessly as patients they could have saved died simply because the things they needed to treat them never arrived. He revealed to me that this wasn't being caused by a war. No bombs were falling. No armies were invading. It also wasn't caused by a natural disaster like an earthquake or hurricane. The buildings were still standing. The infrastructure was still there. What was causing all this chaos was something harder to see and harder to fight: the complete collapse of the supply chains that modern society depends on for everything. He showed me truck drivers parking their big rigs and walking away because the cost of fuel made it impossible to make deliveries profitably. He showed me farms where food was growing beautifully in the fields, tomatoes ripe and red, corn tall and ready, vegetables of all kinds, but the food was rotting right there in the fields because there was no way to transport it to the cities where people were hungry. The trucks weren't running. The drivers weren't working. The fuel wasn't available. So perfectly good food just sat there and spoiled while people in cities went hungry. He revealed to me how humanity had built a world of incredible convenience over the past century, but in doing so, we had made everything extremely fragile. He showed me how everything had become connected. Food production in one country depended on trucks from another country, which depended on fuel from a third country, which depended on parts manufactured in a fourth country. When one piece of this complex puzzle failed, it triggered failures in everything else, like dominoes falling. He told me that people, including his own followers, had become completely dependent on these fragile systems. We had forgotten the simple skills and knowledge that our great-grandparents knew instinctively: how to grow food, how to store food, how to survive without grocery stores and supply trucks and global distribution networks. The vision shifted, and he showed me families trapped in city apartments. They had money in their bank accounts, but money was worthless when there was nothing to buy. The stores were empty. Online deliveries had stopped. They couldn't feed their children no matter how much money they had because food simply wasn't available. He showed me elderly people, folks around my own age who had worked their entire lives, saved money, planned for retirement, doing everything society told them to do to be responsible. Now they sat in their homes, helpless and afraid, because their money couldn't buy what didn't exist. They had no skills to fall back on, no knowledge of how to provide for themselves outside the system they had trusted completely. I saw children crying from hunger. Not because their parents didn't love them or didn't want to feed them, but because their parents had no food to give them. I watched parents stand in government distribution lines for hours, hoping to receive just enough basic rations to keep their families alive for another day. The look of desperation and shame on their faces broke my heart. But then Jesus showed me something different, and the contrast was stunning. In the middle of all this chaos and suffering, there were families and small communities who were not just surviving, they were calm, peaceful, even helping their neighbors survive. These people had something the desperate crowds didn't have. They had gardens. Not small decorative flower beds with a few pretty plants. I mean real food gardens, bursting with vegetables and fruits, organized and productive. Some were in backyards, some in front yards, some in community spaces. These gardens were producing large amounts of actual food that was feeding families and being shared with neighbors. As Jesus showed me these gardens, I noticed something unusual. Every single garden, whether it belonged to a single family or a group of neighbors working together, had the same 7 types of plants growing in them. Not random vegetables, but these same 7 plants appearing over and over in every prepared garden I saw. He instructed me to watch carefully and explained that these 7 plants were not random or accidental. Each one served a specific purpose that would become absolutely critical in the months ahead. He told me that people who planted these 7 plants early in 2026, in January, February, and March, would harvest exactly when the collapse reached its worst point in September and the fall. But people who waited, who put it off or didn't believe the warning, would face severe hunger and would have no time to recover from their delay. The first plant he showed me was potatoes. I saw mountains of potatoes being harvested from gardens, from raised beds, from large containers, from traditional garden rows, even from grow bags on apartment balconies. The potato harvest was abundant everywhere I looked. He explained to me that a single potato plant, properly cared for, could produce 10 pounds of food. Potatoes grow in almost any climate as long as they have enough water. They don't require much space. You can grow them in a bucket if you have to. And once harvested, they store for months without needing refrigeration or special equipment. Just keep them in a cool, dark place, and they'll last. He told me that when grain shipments stopped coming to cities, when bread disappeared from store shelves, when people could no longer buy flour or rice or pasta, potatoes would keep families alive. They provide carbohydrates and calories, they fill stomachs, and they can be prepared in dozens of ways. But, and he emphasized this strongly, potatoes need to be planted in late January and early February in most climates to mature before the summer heat gets too intense, and to be ready for harvest before the fall crisis hits full force. The second plant was beans. I watched families harvesting 2 types of beans from their gardens. Some were picking green beans to eat fresh right away, snapping them off the plants and taking them inside for dinner that same day. Others were letting their bean plants dry completely, then harvesting dried beans that looked like the ones you buy in bags at the store. He explained to me that beans were special because they actually improve the soil while they grow. They have a relationship with bacteria in the soil that takes nitrogen from the air and puts it into the ground, making other plants grow better. This is called nitrogen fixing, and it means that beans help everything else in the garden thrive. He also told me that beans provide protein, which becomes critical when meat becomes too expensive or completely unavailable. Humans need protein to stay strong and healthy, and beans can provide that protein even when animal products disappear from the diet. He showed me 2 types of beans that were especially important. Bush beans are compact plants that produce quickly, giving you food in just 50 to 60 days. Pole beans grow tall on supports and produce abundantly over a longer period, continuing to make beans for months if you keep harvesting them. Dried beans, he explained, could sustain human life for years if stored properly in sealed containers. They don't go bad. They just sit there ready to be cooked whenever you need them. He told me to plant beans now, in early 2026, and to plant them in succession, some every 2 weeks, so that harvest would continue throughout the growing season. The third plant was tomatoes. I saw massive tomato plants that were as tall as I was, heavy with fruit in every stage of ripeness, green tomatoes still growing, orange ones almost ready, and brilliant red ones perfect for eating. Some gardens had them growing in the ground, others had them in large pots on patios or apartment balconies. He explained to me that tomatoes provide vitamins and minerals that prevent disease when people's diets become limited during food shortages. When you can't get fresh fruit or a variety of vegetables, tomatoes help keep you healthy. They provide vitamin C, which prevents sickness. They provide nutrients that keep your immune system working. He showed me how versatile tomatoes are. They can be eaten fresh right off the plant. They can be cooked into sauce and canned or preserved. They can be dried and stored. They can be frozen. A single tomato plant, he told me, could produce 50 pounds of food across a growing season if properly cared for. What amazed me was seeing tomato plants thriving even in small spaces. He showed me apartment dwellers with just a small balcony who were growing enough tomatoes in large containers to make a real difference in their food supply. You don't need a huge yard or farm. Just some soil, a container, sun, and water. The fourth plant surprised me because I had never thought of it as particularly important. It was squash. Both summer squash and winter squash filled the gardens he was showing me. He explained to me that squash plants are extremely generous. You plant one small seed, and it grows into a plant that can feed an entire family for weeks. Summer squash, like zucchini and yellow squash, produce continuously throughout the growing season. You harvest them when they're small and tender, and the plant just keeps making more. One plant can give you dozens of squash across the summer. Winter squash, like butternut squash, acorn squash, and pumpkins, take longer to mature, but they produce fruits that store for 6 months or more without any processing or refrigeration. Just harvest them before the first frost, put them in a cool place, and they sit there staying good until you're ready to eat them. This makes them incredibly valuable when refrigeration fails or electricity becomes unreliable. He told me that squash grows where other plants might struggle. They're tough and adaptable. They produce abundantly even with minimal care. And they provide both fresh food during summer and stored food for winter. The fifth plant was leafy greens. I saw lettuce, kale, spinach, and Swiss chard growing in gardens everywhere. People were harvesting leaves continuously from the same plants, taking a few leaves for a salad or a meal, and leaving the plant to continue growing and producing more leaves. He explained to me that greens grow fast. You can harvest lettuce in just 30 days from planting. They grow in shade where other plants won't produce. They grow in cold weather when tomatoes and beans would die. They grow in very small spaces, even in containers on a windowsill. You don't need much room to grow greens. He told me that greens provide nutrients that prevent sickness when people can no longer afford varied diets or when grocery stores run out of fresh produce. They provide vitamins that keep your body functioning properly. They're ready to eat quickly when hunger is immediate and can't wait for long growing seasons. And you can plant them repeatedly, every 2 weeks plant more seeds, from early spring through late fall, giving you fresh food for most of the year. The sixth plant seemed insignificant at first. It was herbs, basil, cilantro, parsley, oregano, thyme, and others. Honestly, I thought, why would anyone care about herbs when they're struggling to get basic food? But he corrected my thinking immediately. He explained to me that when food becomes scarce and monotonous, eating the same basic staples day after day, herbs make the difference between meals that people can barely force down and meals that actually nourish both body and spirit. Flavor matters. It affects whether people, especially children, will actually eat the food available. Herbs transform boring beans or plain potatoes into something people want to eat. More importantly, he told me, many herbs have medicinal properties. Oregano has antibacterial qualities. Thyme helps with respiratory problems. Peppermint settles upset stomachs. Chamomile calms anxiety and helps with sleep. When pharmacies are empty and doctors can't get medications, these plants can treat common ailments and keep people healthier. Herbs are also easy to grow. They don't need much space. They grow in pots. Many grow all year indoors on a sunny windowsill. Their survival and healing packed into small packages that anyone can grow even if they have almost no room. The seventh plant, he explained, was the most critical of all, though I didn't immediately understand why. It was garlic and onions. I saw them growing in every single garden he showed me, often tucked between other plants or lining the edges of garden beds. He told me these are medicine, food, and preservation all in one. Garlic and onions boost immune systems, helping people fight off disease when sickness spreads through malnourished populations. They add flavor to food when nothing else is available, making bland survival meals actually edible. And they help preserve other foods when refrigeration fails. Both garlic and onions have natural antibacterial and antifungal properties that keep other foods from spoiling as quickly. He emphasized that garlic and onions need to be planted now, in late January, for harvest in summer when they'll be needed most. You plant them as cloves or small bulbs, they grow through winter and spring, and by June or July, each clove has multiplied into a whole bulb with multiple new cloves. It's multiplication: you plant one, you harvest 10 or more. He told me that every survival garden absolutely must include garlic and onions. They're not optional extras. They're essentials that will make the difference between health and sickness, between food that sustains and food that barely keeps you alive. As I watched these 7 plants growing abundantly in garden after garden while surrounding neighborhoods descended into desperation and chaos, I began to understand the larger message. This wasn't really about becoming farmers or going back to some primitive lifestyle. This was about recovering a basic human capability that had been lost in just 2 generations, the ability to feed yourself independent of systems that could fail. Our great-grandparents knew how to do this. They maintained gardens not as hobbies but as necessities. They knew which plants produced the most food with the least space and effort. They knew how to store food without refrigeration. They knew how to preserve harvests. They knew how to save seeds for next year's planting. But somewhere along the way, my generation and the ones after forgot all of this. We trusted completely in grocery stores and supply chains, never imagining they could actually fail. But then Jesus told me something even deeper that made everything click into place. He said that these 7 plants weren't just about physical survival. They represented something much more important. They represented trust, learning to trust God rather than human systems. He explained to me that when you plant a seed, you're performing an act of faith. You're trusting God to provide sunshine and rain. You're trusting natural systems that God created to work the way He designed them. You're trusting that a tiny seed will become a plant that feeds you. This trust in God's natural provision is completely different from trusting human systems that can fail. He told me that his people, Christians, believers, had stopped trusting God in this basic, practical way. We say we trust God, but we actually trust our paychecks, our bank accounts, our grocery stores, our government programs. When those things fail, our faith falls apart because it was never really in God to begin with. It was in systems that felt reliable but were actually fragile. The act of planting a garden forces you to trust God. You can't control whether it rains. You can't make seeds germinate faster. You can't force plants to grow. You can only do your part: prepare soil, plant seeds, water, weed, and then trust God to do His part. This is what real faith looks like in practical terms. Then he showed me what would happen to people who heard this warning but didn't act on it. This vision was harder to watch than the images of collapse. I saw elderly people, folks my own age and older, who heard the warning about planting gardens but dismissed it. They thought it was paranoia or overreaction. They trusted that governments or aid organizations would take care of them if crisis came. Their faith was in institutions and systems, not in God's provision through nature. When those systems collapsed as predicted, these people had nothing to fall back on. Their last years of life, which should have been peaceful, were marked by suffering that could have been completely prevented with a few packets of seeds and a small patch of dirt. Watching them struggle broke my heart because the solution had been so simple and the warning so clear, but they chose not to listen. Then he showed me another group that made me even sadder: families who heard the warning and intended to act on it but kept putting it off. They meant to start gardens. They really did. But work was busy. The weather wasn't quite right yet. They get to it next month. There was always a reason to delay. Then suddenly it was September, and the collapse had begun. Store shelves emptied overnight. Seed companies had sold out of inventory or shut down entirely. The knowledge these families needed, the experience that comes from actually watching plants grow through a full season, learning from mistakes, figuring out what works in your specific soil and climate, they didn't have any of that knowledge. Their first attempts at gardening came during the worst possible time, when mistakes meant starvation rather than just learning experiences. A plant dying when you have a full refrigerator and pantry is no big deal. A plant dying when that plant is your only food source is a crisis. He showed me the dramatic difference between people who started in January and those who waited until September to take it seriously. The January starters had already been harvesting lettuce, radishes, and early squash by May. By June their tomato plants were setting fruit. By July their potato plants were ready to dig up. By September, when crisis hit, they had already learned what worked and what didn't. They had time to adjust and improve. They had built relationships with their soil and their plants. But the September starters stood in front of empty store shelves, finally ready to take the warning seriously, finally understanding it wasn't exaggeration, but now it was too late. They had seed packets in their hands but nowhere to buy them. Even if they found seeds, they were now planting in crisis mode with no room for error and no time for learning. I watched children in these two types of families, and the contrast was striking. In the families that started gardens in January, kids worked alongside their parents, learning skills that schools no longer taught. They learned to recognize when plants need water by how the leaves look. They learned to harvest vegetables without damaging plants. They learned to save seeds for next year. They learned that food comes from work and soil and time, not from stores and money. He told me these children would survive what was coming because they understood what their parents had forgotten. They knew that food is grown, not bought. When other children were completely dependent on systems that failed, these children had practical skills that made them valuable to their communities. Then Jesus showed me something about community that completely changed how I understood the whole situation. I saw neighborhoods where multiple families had started gardens in January. At first everyone grew the same basic 7 plants I had been shown. But as they gained experience over the spring and summer, people began specializing based on what grew best in their particular soil or what they enjoyed most. One family focused intensely on tomatoes, growing 10 different varieties and becoming real experts. Another family became the potato masters, producing huge harvests and learning all the tricks for storage. A third family specialized in beans and peas, another in squash, another in greens and herbs. When September came and the crisis began, these neighborhoods transformed into self-sufficient networks. The tomato family traded with the potato family. The bean growers exchanged with the squash experts. Nobody had to grow everything themselves because they could trade with neighbors who specialized in different crops. They weren't just surviving individually, they had created interdependent communities that didn't need outside systems. He told me this is how humans were meant to live. Not isolated. Not completely dependent on distant corporations that don't know or care about them. But in communities where people provide for each other through their own labor and skill. The coming crisis would force this transformation. People who started gardens now would become leaders in these new community networks. People who waited would be begging to join communities that had no room for them. But then he told me he wanted to show me the spiritual dimension of what he was asking, and the vision shifted to show me the same gardens from a different perspective. Now I could somehow see into the hearts of people who were planting and tending their gardens. For many of them, the act of gardening was becoming a form of prayer and worship. They would step into their garden plots each morning, and in the quiet repetition of weeding and watering, they found themselves talking to God in ways they never had sitting in church pews. The garden became a sanctuary. The work became worship. Pulling weeds became meditation. Watering plants became prayer. I watched one man who had been anxious and fearful about the future. Every news report sent him spiraling into panic about economic collapse or political chaos. But once he started his garden, something changed in him. Each morning he checked his plants and saw new growth. A tomato ripening, bean pods forming, potato plants spreading, and his faith grew along with the plants. He was watching God's provision manifest in real time. Those tiny seeds he'd planted were becoming food. The abstract concept of trusting God became concrete as he learned to trust the systems God created in nature. I saw a woman who had struggled with control issues her entire life. She wanted to manage everything, plan every detail, eliminate all uncertainty from her life. But in her garden, she was forced to surrender control. She couldn't make seeds germinate faster no matter how much she wanted to. She couldn't control the weather. She couldn't force growth. She could only do her part and trust God to do his part. That garden was transforming her relationship with God more effectively than decades of sermons had done. Jesus then explained to me that the 7 plants weren't random even on a spiritual level. Each one taught a specific spiritual lesson that his people needed to learn right now. Tomatoes, he said, teach consistency. They need regular care, not sporadic attention. You can't water them randomly or forget about them for weeks and expect them to thrive. They need consistent daily attention. Christians who only check in with God during crises will fail like tomato plants that get watered randomly. Faith requires daily consistency. Potatoes teach faith in what's unseen. You plant them and see nothing but green tops for months. You tend those leaves not knowing what's developing underground. You have to trust that work is happening beneath the soil where you can't see it. This is exactly how faith works. You can't see what God is doing in the invisible spiritual realm, but if you're faithful in what's visible in your daily life, God is working in the invisible areas you can't perceive. Beans teach multiplication. One bean becomes a plant that produces hundreds of beans. This is kingdom mathematics. What you give to God, he multiplies beyond what seems naturally possible. But you have to plant that first seed. You have to give God something to work with. You can't experience multiplication without first giving something. Squash teaches strategic thinking. You plant squash once and it produces for months. God's people need to stop looking for quick fixes and start investing in solutions that sustain them long-term. One wise decision made now prevents dozens of desperate decisions later. Greens teach continuous harvest. You don't wait until the plant is finished growing to receive benefit. You take what's ready today and let the plant keep growing for tomorrow. This is how you should approach God. Take what he gives you today, be nourished by it, and trust that there's more coming. Don't wait for some future, complete blessing while ignoring the daily provision he's offering right now. Herbs teach that small things matter. They seem insignificant compared to plants that produce pounds of food, but flavor matters, beauty matters, medicine matters. God's people overlook small blessings while chasing big miracles. The herbs teach you to value what God is giving you even when it seems small. Garlic and onions teach preparation and preservation. You plant them long before you need them. You use them to make other foods last longer. This is wisdom, preparing before crisis comes, and using what God gives you to extend the usefulness of everything else in your life. I realized I was watching a complete discipleship program disguised as gardening advice. Every principle Jesus was teaching through these plants applied directly to spiritual life. The garden wasn't just preparing people physically for crisis. It was preparing them spiritually for testing that was coming. He told me that people who embraced this message now would receive double provision. Their bodies would be fed by the food they grew. Their spirits would be fed by the lessons they learned while growing it. But those who ignored this warning would face double disaster. Their bodies would go hungry because they didn't prepare physically, and their spirits would collapse because they never learned the faith lessons that come from depending on God's provision. The timeline accelerated forward in the vision. I watched January gardens becoming February gardens. March brought the first real harvests of greens and radishes. April produced more food than families could eat themselves, so they started sharing with neighbors. May brought abundance. June showed people they could actually feed themselves independent of stores. July built confidence. August confirmed that the whole approach actually worked. Then September arrived. The vision showed me exactly what Jesus had warned about. Financial systems imploded overnight. I don't fully understand economics, but I watched stock markets collapse, banks close their doors, currencies lose value so rapidly that money became nearly worthless. Store shelves emptied within hours as people panic-bought everything available. Gas stations ran dry. The infrastructure that everyone had trusted completely was failing in ways that seemed impossible until they happened. In neighborhoods where nobody had gardens, panic became violence within days. People who had never missed a meal in their lives were suddenly desperate. They drove around frantically searching for stores that still had food, not realizing that some of their neighbors' backyards were full of growing food. But in the neighborhoods where families had started gardens in January, a completely different scene unfolded. The contrast was staggering. While chaos consumed unprepared communities, these garden neighborhoods had become islands of peace in a sea of panic. Families who planted in January were harvesting daily. They had tomatoes, beans, squash, potatoes, greens, real food when stores were empty. They had purpose and productive work when others had only fear. They had something to share when their neighbors had nothing. I watched one particular man who had mocked his wife back in February when she insisted on planting a big garden. He thought she was being paranoid and wasting time. He complained about the work and the space it took. But now in September he stood in his backyard with tears streaming down his face. His children were eating fresh tomatoes and beans and potatoes while his coworkers' kids 3 blocks away were going hungry. The garden his wife had insisted on, despite his complaints, was now the only thing standing between his family and starvation. I saw a woman who had been embarrassed by her front yard garden back in March. The Homeowners Association had complained that vegetables in the front yard looked messy and brought down property values. Neighbors had whispered criticisms. She had almost given up and removed it. But in September those same neighbors came knocking on her door with desperation in their eyes, asking if she had any food to spare. The garden that seemed foolish in spring had become wisdom in fall. Jesus told me, "See how preparation looks like foolishness until crisis proves it wise." Noah looked crazy building an ark until rain started. Joseph looked obsessive storing grain until famine hit. My people who plant now will look extreme until September proves them right. The vision shifted to show me families who had heard the garden warning but delayed acting on it. They had meant to start. They planned to begin. But January became February, February became March, March became April, and they never quite got around to it. By the time they finally took it seriously, it was too late to plant most of what they needed. He said to me with deep sorrow in his voice, "These are they who heard but did not act." They received warning months in advance. They had time, resources, and clear instructions. But they treated urgency as suggestion. They confused patience with procrastination. Now they will reap the harvest of their delay. I watched these families scrambling in September trying to plant things that needed to have been started in January. Their desperation was heartbreaking because it was completely preventable. The warning had been clear. The timing had been specific. They simply chose to ignore both. But Jesus showed me something else that gave me hope. Even in September, even in crisis, those who turned to him with genuine repentance still found provision. It didn't come from their own gardens because those didn't exist. It came from gardens of the obedient ones who shared generously. It came from supernatural multiplication of the little they had. It came from unexpected sources, like ravens bringing bread to Elijah in the Bible. He told me, "My provision never fails. But it flows most abundantly through the channel of obedience." Those who obeyed the garden instruction become my distributors to those who didn't. This is always how I work. The prepared feed the unprepared, and both learn lessons about trusting me. The scene expanded to show me something even more sobering. While some neighborhoods descended into chaos and others thrived through preparation, something else was unfolding that connected directly to biblical prophecy about the end times. I saw government trucks rolling through desperate communities offering food distribution. Lines stretched for blocks. Families who had gone days without adequate meals pressed forward eagerly toward the trucks. The workers distributing food were efficient and organized. They had plenty of supplies, but there was a requirement to receive any of it. Jesus said quietly, "Watch how they present the necessity." The workers explained to people in line that the distribution system had to be carefully managed to prevent hoarding and ensure fairness. Everyone receiving food needed to register in a new global resource management system. It was simple, they said. Just a quick scan, a small biometric marker placed on your hand or forehead, and you'd have instant approval to receive food, medicine, and fuel whenever needed. I watched faces in those lines. Hungry faces. Worried faces. Faces of parents who would do anything to feed their children. The choice seemed obvious to them. A tiny mark in exchange for survival. Who could refuse that when your children were crying from hunger? But then Jesus showed me the gardens again. Families with food growing in their yards didn't need to stand in those lines. They didn't face the pressure of that impossible choice because they had made a different choice months earlier. The decision to plant in January determined whether they faced the mark decision in September. He explained to me, this is why the garden matters spiritually even more than physically. Those who depend on my provision through the soil don't become dependent on the beast system for survival. Those who learn to trust me with seeds and rain don't need to trust the enemy for food and water. The vision revealed the full strategy. The crisis wasn't random bad luck or natural disaster. It was orchestrated specifically to create the exact type of desperation that would make people accept what they would otherwise refuse. Hungry people don't ask questions. Desperate parents don't examine fine print. Fear makes people compliant. But those families with gardens had something more valuable than food. They had options. They could say no to the mark because they had alternative provision. Their obedience back in January had bought them freedom in September. I saw this pattern repeating all over the world, in every nation. Communities that had prepared had leverage. Communities that hadn't prepared had only desperation. The prepared could afford to refuse the mark. The unprepared felt they couldn't. Then Jesus showed me something I could barely comprehend. The spiritual realm behind the physical reality. Dark spiritual entities, demons I suppose, swarmed around the food distribution centers, feeding on the fear and desperation. But over the gardens, I saw angels standing guard. The atmosphere above neighborhoods with gardens was completely different. Peace where there should have been panic. Faith where there should have been fear. He told me, your physical preparation creates space for spiritual clarity. When your body isn't screaming for food, your spirit can hear my voice clearly. When you're not desperate, you can make wise choices. This is why I told you to prepare. Not because I can't provide miraculously, but because desperation makes you vulnerable to deception. The vision shifted to show me churches, and this part grieved me deeply. Some churches had heeded the garden warning. They had turned their properties into food production spaces. Members planted together, learned together, and now harvested together, sharing abundantly with their communities. These congregations became lighthouses in darkness, physically feeding people while spiritually pointing them toward Jesus. But other churches, including some with pastors I recognized, had dismissed the warning as unspiritual. They insisted that focusing on physical preparation showed lack of faith. They taught their people to just trust God to provide, without taking any practical steps. Now their members stood in food distribution lines facing the mark decision with empty stomachs and clouded judgment. I saw pastors weeping as they realized their theology had left their flocks vulnerable. They had meant well. They genuinely believed preparation equaled lack of faith. But Jesus showed me how the enemy had twisted Scripture to make obedience look like unbelief. Jesus asked me, did I not tell Joseph to store grain before famine? Did I not tell Noah to build an ark before the flood? Did I not instruct my people to gather manna daily? I have always required partnership between my supernatural provision and your natural obedience. Those who divorce the two understand neither. The vision pulled back further, showing me the next several months. October brought more pressure. November intensified it. By December the mark system was fully implemented globally. Those who had accepted it back in September when they were desperate now tried to convince resistors to join them. I watched families fractured by this division. Parents who had taken the mark couldn't understand why their adult children refused. Siblings stopped speaking. Churches split right down the middle. The mark created a separation that went far deeper than physical or social. It was spiritual surgery, dividing those who would ultimately stand with Christ from those who would ultimately bow to the beast system. But throughout all of this chaos and division, the garden communities remained distinct and unified. They had built something during those months of growing food together: trust, relationships, shared purpose, mutual dependence. When crisis came, they didn't fracture like other communities. They unified and strengthened. Jesus said, "You thought I was teaching you to grow tomatoes. I was teaching you to grow community. You thought you were planting seeds. You were planting relationships that would sustain you when everything else collapsed." The vision accelerated through the following months, and I saw how those garden communities became the nucleus of resistance against the Mark system. They had their own food, so they didn't need the beast's provision. They had their own networks, so they didn't need the beast's infrastructure. They had their own identity rooted in Christ, so they didn't need the beast's approval. What struck me most was watching the enemy's frustration. The dark forces had planned this Mark system for generations. They had designed it carefully to exploit human weakness. They crafted it to be irresistible during crisis. But these simple garden communities had stumbled onto the one defense the enemy hadn't fully anticipated: self-sufficiency rooted in obedience to God. These weren't survivalists hoarding for selfish reasons. They weren't preppers motivated by fear and paranoia. They were believers who had simply done what Jesus told them to do back in January, and that basic obedience had positioned them perfectly for September's test. One final scene appeared before the vision ended. Jesus showed me the timeline from heaven's perspective, and suddenly everything made perfect sense. The garden warning in January wasn't random timing. September's Mark implementation wasn't a surprise to heaven. The enemy had scheduled his move long ago. God had scheduled the preparation to align perfectly. Those who listened in January were ready in September. Those who dismissed the garden message as too practical, too focused on earthly things, too unspiritual found themselves spiritually unprepared when physical crisis created spiritual pressure. Jesus asked me, "Do you understand now? The enemy uses physical desperation to force spiritual compromise. I use physical obedience to build spiritual strength." Your gardens weren't just about food. They were about learning to hear my voice and obey it even when my instructions seemed strange. Those who couldn't obey the small instruction about planting couldn't obey the large instruction about refusing the mark. I watched as faithful garden communities became underground networks helping people who were fleeing the mark system. They hid people, fed people, created resistance networks that frustrated every attempt to eliminate them. The skills they learned growing food together translated directly into skills needed for survival outside the beast system. But Jesus showed me one more thing that was difficult to witness. I saw believers who had prepared gardens but then abandoned their principles when pressure came. They had planted tomatoes in January, but they took the mark in September anyway because their hearts hadn't actually changed. The garden was supposed to transform them, but they had treated it as just a task to complete rather than a lesson to absorb. He explained, "Physical preparation without spiritual transformation is worthless." Some of my people thought the garden was the point. They missed that the garden was the classroom where I was teaching them to trust me, to work with others, to build something sustainable. They got the produce but missed the lesson. The vision began to fade, but Jesus turned to face me fully one last time. His eyes held oceans of compassion mixed with urgent seriousness. He told me, "Your task is to tell them what you've seen. Not to scare them, but to prepare them. Not to create panic, but to inspire obedience. Tell them that small acts of obedience in seasons of peace become lifelines in seasons of crisis. Tell them that what seems foolish now will prove wise later. Tell them I am still speaking, still warning, still preparing those who have ears to hear." The light around us intensified until I could barely see his form anymore, but his voice remained crystal clear. "You will wake up now. You will remember everything. Some will believe you. Many will not. Your job is to speak faithfully regardless of response. The harvest is coming, both the harvest of souls and the harvest of consequences for choices made. Those who plant in obedience will reap in abundance. Those who mock the planting will beg for the harvest." I felt myself being pulled away from that place, from that presence that had shown me such staggering truth. Part of me wanted to stay, wanted to remain in that clarity where everything made sense. But I knew I had an assignment. The warning had to be delivered while there was still time to act on it. The hospital room materialized around me. Machines beeped. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. My daughter Grace sat beside the bed, her head bowed in what I could tell was prayer. She looked up as I gasped for air, her face transforming from grief to shock to overwhelming joy in a matter of seconds. "Dad!" Her voice cracked with emotion. "You're awake. You've been gone." Your heart stopped. They were doing CPR for so long. They almost gave up. I couldn't speak yet. My throat felt raw. My body felt heavy after the weightlessness of that other realm. But my mind was racing with everything I had witnessed. The gardens, the mark, September, the choice that would divide families and churches and nations. Doctors rushed in, amazed at my recovery. They ran tests, checked my vital signs, asked questions I barely processed. How could I explain where I had been? How could I make them understand that I had just witnessed the next year of human history compressed into minutes that felt like hours? That was 3 weeks ago. Today is January 24th, 2026. Everything I saw is seared into my memory with a clarity that hasn't faded even slightly. If anything, it has become sharper and more urgent with each passing day. I've already started planting. Garlic cloves went into the ground yesterday, pressed into soil that I'm learning to read like scripture. Each one represents faith that what Jesus showed me wasn't hallucination or dream, but a warning from heaven itself. Grace is helping me. She believes completely, not because of my words, but because of what she sees in my eyes. She knows her father came back different, changed, carrying something too heavy to be anything but real. I've been making phone calls, reaching out to pastors, friends, family members, anyone who might listen. The responses have been mixed. Some hear the warning and immediately start making changes. They're ordering seeds, preparing garden beds, asking questions about what to plant and when. Others dismiss it politely as trauma-induced hallucination, the brain's response to oxygen deprivation during cardiac arrest. A few have been openly hostile, accusing me of spreading fear or false prophecy. But I know what I saw. I know who I met. And I know that the instructions about gardens weren't metaphorical or symbolic. They were practical preparation for a real test that's coming. Those who obey these strange instructions now will understand their purpose later. I don't know if you'll believe me. I can't prove any of it. I can only testify to what I witnessed and deliver the message I was commanded to deliver. Jesus is still speaking. Heaven is still warning. The choice of how to respond rests with each person who hears these words. The vision was clear. The timeline was specific. The instructions were practical. Now the question is whether we'll have the faith to obey instructions that seem strange, the courage to prepare when others mock preparation, and the wisdom to recognize that small obedience in January becomes survival in September. My comfortable retirement doesn't matter anymore. Only faithfulness matters. Only obedience matters. Only making sure that those who have ears to hear actually hear what heaven is declaring about the months ahead. September is coming. The mark system is coming. The pressure to conform is coming. But so is God's provision for those who position themselves to receive it. The garden communities will become resistance networks. The relationships formed over planting and harvesting will become lifelines when everything else collapses. I'm 70 years old. I died for those minutes on the operating table. But I was sent back with a message. This is that message. What you do with it is between you and God. But don't say you weren't warned. Don't say nobody told you. The warning has been delivered while there's still time to act. Plant your garden. Build your community. Learn to trust God's provision through the soil He created. The test is coming. Be ready.